Hello, I'm doing something a tad bit different today, in that I am going to give you guys a short documentary. It's longer than most my normal videos, but yeah, I'll just see if everyone likes it. Hopefully everyone does. So, we all know about the settlement of Europeans in the Americas in the Age of Discovery. We have learned all about Hernan Cortez, Miles Standish, and many others. Some of us have even learned about the cultures that they would ultimately try to subjugate, such as the Aztec, the Inca, the Pequot, the Lakota, and many others. But very few have noted the settlement patterns of the European and American settlers, and some misconceptions about historical thoughts. One of the largest of these was the American West. Rather than merely an effort to stretch U.S. land holdings from sea to shining sea and manifest destiny, it was an effort just to move to the West Coast, leaving the interior alone. How trade with Asia and Europe did as much to build the Continental Railroad as connecting the east and west portions of the United States. And how Native American tribes produced much more complicated and varied political structures and militaries, especially between settled and nomadic tribes, than is often taught in most public schools. This video is being sponsored by nobody. That's right, nobody is paying for this stuff, which means that I need to search far and wide on the internet to find pictures and other materials that are copyright free, and it's just me. So to help support the channel, please go check out my Patreon account. I'll see you there. Also, I've recently been alerted to a privacy-focused browser, Brave. When you use it, they block lots of tracking cookies and ads, and you can use it to earn basic attention tokens, a cryptocurrency that you can donate to creators like myself, or keep for yourself through an Uphold wallet. So, if you would like to help support the channel, and like your privacy, use my Brave browser link below and check it out. And after that shameless advert, let's get to the video. Ever since Europeans began sailing to the Americas, they began interacting with the natives that lived there. As a child, I often grew up with stories of the proverbial cowboys versus Indians, or settlers versus Indians, or something like that. And I learned in public school of how basically European and American cultures steamrolled over Native Americans. And I also grew up with stories of the gallant battles that Native tribes fought to preserve their homelands. But nobody told me of the earliest settlements. How Europeans, in the beginning, knew they did not have the numbers or strength to fight the native cultures and needed to adhere to the alliances and customs of this war that they are entering, and that it was more of luck that crumbled the native tribal structures, allowing these settlers to gain a foothold. How the interior of North America, today's Midwest, was basically ignored until after the American Civil War, and that the mythic West was largely just the coastlines of California and Oregon. And far from mastering a pristine wilderness, Europeans and Americans had only stayed in areas that had previously been settled and transformed by Native American tribes, and simply tried to dominate the land and nomadic tribes of the Great Plains when technology proved sufficient to do so. Lastly, the very foundations of many of the cities, streets and freeways and much more were laid out initially, if indirectly, by native tribes. I will mention a few of them, but in a macro-style history like this, it is important to note that there were thousands of tribal nations, and it would be impossible for me to go over all the complexities of each encounter between the tribes and settlers. This being said, while there are always exceptions, my information will be of major actions and general trends. To understand all this, let's first take a look at environmental history. Environmental history, in its most basic terms, is how human beings have viewed and affected their environment, and how the environment itself has influenced the development of human cultures. The plains offered a vast expanse of grasses and rolling hills. This type of landscape, similar to the Eurasian steppe, encouraged a nomadic or semi-nomadic lifestyle. There weren't many large trees around to build homes, but some would use mud, sod, or thatched grasses, almost like the ancient Mississippians. But more commonly, animal hides would do just fine. After the prehistoric megafauna had disappeared, the next largest animals around, the bison and other game, often moved from place to place. Farming would be okay, but game was needed for food, tools, lightweight building material, and trade. So sometimes fields were planted, but left to grow as the tribe moved around, and they would often come back to harvest the area later. For instance, the tribes that moved onto the Great Plains at first lived in that semi-nomadic lifestyle. Several groups farmed in the area, as well as hunted. So farming, hunting, and moving to different, but most likely set, locations at different times of the year was normal, meaning they would move from point A to point B to point C, and then back to point A to start the cycle all over again throughout the year. But the environment wouldn't always stay this way. Trees were constantly threatening to fence in the plains, and massive herds were picky, only wanting to travel to places with enough grass or other food to sustain the group. To fix both potential problems, early native inhabitants would engage in trying to control nature and the landscape to suit their needs. They would do this in the way of lighting controlled fires. As well as killing any upstart trees, prairie fires, with its remaining ash and fried organic matter, fertilized the soil to encourage the growth of grasses for herd animals and for more agriculture. Similar slash and burn methods were practiced in several parts of the continent, as well as other places around the world at the time, and even still to this day. This is important for many of us who grew up with, say, movies like Disney's Pocahontas or other stories that might have been well-meaning, but often presented Native Americans as stereotypical hippies or something. Many beliefs integrated the fauna and landscape into the cultures, which dictated many thoughts and actions for the tribal peoples. The point is, we need to remember that while many had cultural and religious understandings and uses of nature, it doesn't mean that they didn't try to influence it or use it to their benefit. Humans the world over, no matter race or culture, use nature in various ways to survive and thrive. The more important matter is really how much of the environment we use to satisfy our needs. But that is a subject for another video. Trade was always a large part of any society, and as with anything, there was some competition, which at times would lead to conflict. But on the expansive plains with no horses, conflict was limited as long as the parties could gather enough food and resources for trade and lifestyle. Sure, there must have been the raids and such for bravado and territorial rights, but it would most likely be occasional rather than systemic. Things, however, began to change with the arrival of horses, brought by the Spanish conquistadors. As the animals are traded and bred by certain tribes over time, the horse helped change tribal views of the landscape. Being able to travel longer distances in shorter times, the horse became a symbol of wealth and created a more stratified hierarchy within many tribes, almost like how cattle served in many of the same forms for the Zulu people in southern Africa. Hunting was also increased, with valuable buffalo skins, for example, being traded for corn, metal, and goods from eastern tribes. Herds can be kept up with, and with more efficient tactics, hunters could bring down only the number of animals needed, or one of particular value, rather than the less proficient cliff strategy. The horse and increased trade potential slowly moved many of the plains tribes from semi-nomadic to almost totally nomadic. So instead of spending part of their time planting and harvesting crops, they could save it by just hunting more and trading for the produce grown by other tribes. Of course, the tribe itself could use the meat and bones, but a surplus of hides and other goods might develop after a few hunts, and these could be traded. And trade was expansive. Some goods were traded over long distances, such as hides and shells, while other goods were traded and used immediately. As in any trade structure, values went up and down, depending on availability and preference. In North America, for instance, trade went up and down from Mexico to Canada, and back and forth from the east and west coasts, and from the interior areas to those coastlines. Trade expeditions would meet at designated areas where several tribes gathered to trade for goods, sometimes from places they themselves had likely never been, and for items they rarely encountered in their own territories. To try to take a look at the complexity, let's try some visuals. Trade groups A, B, and C will travel to trading area number 1 in trade group D's territory. Groups A and B will trade their goods and might head home afterward. But Group C with goods from A and B might then travel with Group D, or on their own, to trading area number 2. At trading area number 2, Groups E, F, and G would be waiting to trade. C and D might head back, but Groups E, F, and G now possibly might have goods from Group A, and so on and so on. You can see how it might get complicated. The real trade routes in North America were complicated, and often had many more groups than what we used in the example, and many more trading areas. Some tribes acted as middlemen between others and became wealthy in items and status due to the system. Tribes might have goods from other groups that they may never have heard of, or at most had scant ideas about. When Europeans and later Americans first came on the scene, they became part of this existing trade network. even if they perhaps didn't know how extensive it was. Many of the mountain men, scouts, and explorers of later history would be given the nicknames Trailblazers, suggesting that they had created the trails on their own. While their grit and stories of bravery and survival aren't in doubt and make for extremely engaging stories, many of the trails that they took were actually just trade routes Native Americans had been using for tens or even hundreds of years in some cases. Major trading centers existed in the territories of tribes such as the Zunis, the Pomos, the Chumash, the Arikaras, the Mandans, and many others. While the Mandans, for instance, did hunt some bison themselves, they mostly formed corn, squash, and other crops that they traded to the Lakotas and other plains tribes for buffalo meat and hides. According to Washington Matthews, a veteran and surgeon who not only lived among various Native American groups, such as the Hidatsa and Navajo, but also learned and recorded several tribal languages, wrote of the Mandan trading centers in the 1860s. They also used and still use as ornaments fragments of the abalone shells of the Pacific. 10 years ago, one of these shells, unpolished, sold for a good robe. If they are questioned respecting these shells, the answer that they were brought from the sea. So that means some plains tribes would bring shells, like the abalone from the Pacific Ocean, to trade with the Mandans in present-day North and South Dakota for a good, strong hunting horse or robe or something else. While traders at the time said they could just have similar goods shipped to areas closer to the village in the 1860s, Matthews wrote that while rare, the tribe even traded for these shells before white traders were prevalent. No doubt, long trade networks, akin to larger networks such as the Silk Road, existed in the Americas, where goods from tribes in California could end up 2,000 miles away. It was these major trade centers and villages that Europeans and Americans would mainly settle, and eventually take over the trade routes. Lastly, European and American manufactured goods increased competition along these routes. Tribes, especially on the plains, would go on the warpath more frequently now to not only determine the respect and security within the tribe, but to control more resources for trading. Guns, ammunition, metal tools and weapons, and much more enticed Native Americans all over the continent, and increased their own hunting to trade for these new and specialized goods. They also developed taxes in the form of hides and other valuables that mountain men and others would need to pay or try their best to go unnoticed in order to hunt, trap, or travel through a tribe or band's territory. Some of the furs and goods traded headed back to American and European cities, meaning that inadvertently, Native Americans had participated in and connected their trade routes to a more global scale. When the Spanish first began exploring northern Mexico and into New Mexico, Arizona, and California, they immediately went to the native settlements and cities. The French, trying to set up bases in what is today Florida, had to try to make alliances with the local tribes there, and suffered greatly when those tribes stopped supporting the French camp due to its lack of military support against tribal enemies. The British and Pilgrims settled in areas near or directly on cleared fields that used to be cultivated by native villages. We often hear about the violent conquests, but what about the settlers who came, many of whom tried to settle before any violence erupted? Those early Europeans were often at the mercy, at first anyway, of many native groups and had to make sure that their customs were at least respected, if not understood. Permission was often asked to trade, and many native groups either saw the settlers as trespassers or as potential tools for their own political use in the existing politics and power structures between local tribal nations. The early settlers had to rely on the cultures already there and did not steamroll over everything. But what changed the power balance in favor of the Europeans was the disease factor. Smallpox and other diseases that Europeans and their American descendants had built immunities to over hundreds of years found fresh, near defenseless hosts in the natives of the Americas. The spread would have been staggered if we are to believe Lewis and Clark. Lewis and Clark's map of their expedition in 1804 listed the approximate amount of individuals in a given area, ranging from a few hundred to 1,000 people in each village, sometimes more. And trust me, there are a lot of villages. These numbers that seemed to be the norm were large when compared to the end of that century, where even Custer in 1876 was shocked at a village of near 2,000 individuals at the Little Bighorn. But why move to settled areas when you could just try to find your own spot? Well, permanently settled areas from the coastline and inland to the edges of the Great Plains were prime areas. In many of those places, farmland was already cleared, as well as spaces to build homes. The famed landing of the Pilgrims at Plymouth, Massachusetts, was in an area the Patuxet tribe had already settled. The tribe, however, is believed to have been wiped out due to disease shortly after the landings, with the famed Squanto generally regarded tragically as the last member to die from the tribe. So in essence, it was just easier to do so. Most cities and towns that grew out of European settlement were either placed near or directly on native settlements, most likely starting off as perhaps friendly neighbors to trade with or suspicious interlopers in various situations. The numbers would eventually start to favor the settlers. Increased settler aggressiveness and declining in power and population among the tribes would ultimately cause tensions to rise. As new diseases and eventual warfare took its toll on both tribes and Europeans, the growing influx of European settlers were outmatching the declining numbers of native groups. Once conflict erupted between both sides, it became in essence siege warfare. Settler soldiers used the same tactics that they had done in Europe against themselves for centuries, basically a total war, leaving nothing behind for the enemy. While some native groups also practiced similar types of warfare, the myth of the peaceful hippie-like native being just that, a myth, they were not as successful in matching those violent actions. One of the largest problems, besides ever-declining numbers, was the political structure. While we can discuss micro-tribal structure later, it serves us best to look at macro-intertribal relations for our video today, specifically enemies. Many tribes have always had their traditional enemies that had developed, sometimes over centuries, by the time Europeans arrived. Usually born out of various competitions, this had led to violence before, but with the advent of European settlers, and more importantly, European trade goods, more rampant and aggressive confrontations had broken out. The problem now was that a tribe had to fight its traditional enemies as well as the new settlers. After millions had died from disease, some tribes even being wiped out entirely, power vacuums formed all over the Americas. Low numbers and fierce intertribal conflict meant that they could no longer overpower the settlers, and couldn't dictate terms from a clear position of strength. Others found that allying with some settler groups might enhance their own power, and enable them to dominate their rivals. As European nations competed and fought with each other, native groups were also playing a fine game of diplomacy and warfare to increase their own standings amongst other tribes and settlers. Having a trusted and strong European settler alliance might help to increase the supply of weapons and ammunition. This could help enhance the wealth and security of a tribe by increasing its hunting grounds and defensive capabilities at the expense of their enemies, as well as boost negotiation strength when dealing with the settlers. For instance, part of the Ottawa tribe, when the now well-known French and Indian Wars loomed near, felt that they had to choose a side in the conflict. While they could have easily decided that it wasn't their fight, other tribes in the area were choosing sides already, which might have left them at a disadvantage after the conflict, and so they eventually joined in the war. Taking part in a conflict that didn't necessarily include the tribe itself might increase political standing as well. Tribal peoples were not ignorant of political structures, but were extremely savvy and tried to exploit every situation to either stabilize or increase power. The conflicts at the beginning of what would collectively be called the Indian Wars were not just desperate fights to protect homelands, of which many would become, but a more complex political creature. But this had its drawbacks. The Europeans were not ignorant either of the political situations amongst tribes, and were playing their own political games of strength. They picked up on the tribal rivalries and were trying to exploit groups. Giving a great many trade gifts, for example, to a tribe might just get them to ally on your side in a coming conflict. Knowing of the increasing dependence on European trade goods meant that if one European nation became the dominant power in the region, that dependence could be used to bargain for desirable land and other wants. This was exactly the case by the later half of the 18th century, once Great Britain came to dominate huge swaths of territory in North America. Some native leaders noticed these moves and tried their best to stop it, such as Pontiac, Tecumseh, and the Delaware prophet Neolin. A unified native front to battle an increasingly unified European and then American front presented a formidable enemy. But again, these unified events eventually would crumble from internal tribal politics, giving the upper hand to the larger settler groups. With that power, settler nations began to either trade for or push off the natives from their settled lands into areas the Europeans and Americans did not desire at the time. This is the history many people are familiar with. And while this push never really stops for the settled tribes, even today, the settlers seem to hesitate once they come to the open plains by the dawn of the 19th century. Europeans had explored the plains before the 19th century, the first being Spanish, but first impressions are everything. Getting lost in the prairies and attacked by the Pawnee and other bands, expeditions made early conclusions that there is nothing of value to be found there, and too many hostile tribes. As Americans and Europeans increased their holdings, this expansion stopped at St. Louis, and would not really pick up for decades. When settlers and gold seekers in the early to mid-19th century traveled, they largely bypassed the Plains area. Except for a few forts mainly around Native American trading centers to supply those traders and travelers, most went to California and Oregon, places with coastlines, places where trading and permanent settlements had already been long established, and where many tribes had already been either incorporated or subdued into a society most Americans were familiar with. The Plains, however, created a number of problems for settlement early on. One was the disdain for the area. Often nicknamed the Great American Desert at the time, Senator Daniel Webster summed up those sentiments of the Plains and the whole of what would become the western half of the United States in a message to Congress in 1845. What do we want with this region of savages and wild beasts, of deserts, of shifting sands and whirlwinds of dust, of cactus and prairie dogs? Basically, why should the American people even consider developing it? Along with that belief, it would be expensive and disruptive, as well as the tribes living there were not as easy to subdue. This would cost money and require technology that the United States did not have at the moment in the mid-1800s. The second was the difficulty with the tribal nations. But why were the tribes so difficult? I mean, there were warlike societies in the East and West that fought the settlers, but they eventually got overrun. Dealing with Plains tribes, however, meant learning different tactics. When confronting settled tribes of the East and West, you could burn their crops and destroy their camps and living structures. They couldn't really replace those items quickly, and couldn't very well move their settlement even if they knew in advance that enemies were coming. Without homes and food, the settled tribes were eventually crushed. But when early Europeans and later Americans tried to do the same with the Native Americans of the Plains, it didn't work. The Plains tribes had increasingly become nomadic by the 19th century, as mentioned before. There were no crops to burn, there was no way to try to hold them to a fight and to make them stay and get crushed. Tribes could pick up their camp in under an hour and start moving. They would use hit-and-run tactics, and the army would exhaust itself trying to keep up. So why even go through the effort of trying to subdue the tribes and settle the area? What was the value of controlling the Great Plains? There were plans to try to build a railroad, and not just any railroad, but a rail that would traverse the Great Plains and connect both coastlines. But why build it? For one, it would increase riches by Americans creating farms and towns, meaning more taxpayers and interior trade. But Congressman Thomas Hart Benton also believed it would make the US a prime international trade route if they can get Asian markets to use US railroads to go from California to the East Coast and then ship their goods to European markets and vice versa. But these plans were hotly debated, and were eventually put on hold due to costs, lack of landscape knowledge for building the rail, and the American Civil War. However, a few things sped up the decision-making. Gold was discovered in California and in other places in the 1840s and 50s, and the American Civil War, as terrible as it was responsible for forming massive industrial centers in the North and more efficient styles of business. The United States entered its industrial age, which would help fund the ideas to build the Transcontinental Railroad and settlement of the Midwest. With the funds and infrastructure to finally take on the challenges of the Midwest, the last major problem for control had to be dealt with: the Native Americans. While there were several forts already in the West, and numerous skirmishes and conflicts that had already occurred by the end of 1865, there were still many tribes that were ready and willing to take on any intruders within their lands. The problem remained, however, of how to force these tribes to go onto reservations. The famed General Sherman and some other Civil War generals now began to formulate a plan of how to do just that. Understanding that since the tribes were largely nomadic and highly mobile, the targets changed for the army. No longer would they try to hunt down individual tribes and encampments, but they would now target their means of influence, movement, and food. Forts were now set up near many of the old trading centers, giving the US military a presence in the area and eventually helping to control trade, meaning tribes increasingly had to play by the US rules if they wanted trade goods. Bison, or buffalo, were highly important to food stores as well as religious views held by many of the tribal communities, and thus hunting was encouraged by all means from the US government and business. People riding on trains would just have fun shooting the animals down with no intent of collecting any prize or meat. Others sold the hides for extremely high prices, and industrial centers used the other parts of the animal to grease the gears of industry. As the bison declined in number, many tribes began to slowly starve. Added to this, railroads and increasing lines of supply and communication meant that the army itself could now be supplied all year round, making it not only a formidable foe, but now a nearly unstopping one. One that could raise more troops, food and ammunition even after a defeat, and could attack at any time during the year, giving no rest to those native tribes who didn't comply. And the last part of the strategy would be to kill any native horses the army came across to disrupt their ability to quickly disappear after attacks or escape impending ones. An added exploit presented itself to the US government during this strategy. Noticing that Plains tribes had their own enemy and alliance systems in place, they would try to employ tribes against each other. While this was always a contentious topic, some individuals within tribes, maybe for their own reasons, or maybe because they saw the writing on the wall, felt that it would be the most advantageous to join the US Army as scouts. Many of these scouts most likely believed that if they could prove that they were helpful to the army rather than be combative, their tribe or village would not be affected by the onslaught, or at least gain some benefits or power that other tribes would lose if they lost militarily to the army. It would also give a chance for young warriors to gain battle prestige against traditional enemies. So Army Scouts became important to understand the customs and ways of thought which US Army commanders would be at a severe disadvantage without. But while many of the Scouts were brave warriors and saved the army on several occasions, and many of the frontline troops and officers respected them, the US government far away in Washington enacted many measures that would punish, restrict, or anger allied tribes as well. In the end, as tribes were subdued and rails began to stretch ever deeper into the Midwest, many townships and cities began to form. While some would continue the old model of settling near forts, thus near established trading centers, technology and industry now allowed for towns to spring up almost anywhere, regardless of it being settled previously or not. The struggle for the settlement of the Midwest roughly took only 20 years, dismantling the final refuge of native cultures that had existed before the arrival of Columbus. By 1890, most tribal peoples in all the US were on reservations, and throughout the years, their presence had nearly been forgotten in many areas that had thus become metropolitan cities and towns. Regardless of that, many places in the US still hold Native American names, even if many of their current residents don't realize it. And it's important for us to remember that many existing cities in the US began as settlements of tribal peoples. Once technology had developed, it was possible to create similar cities and towns in any area, previously settled or not. But in some forms at least, our present roads, freeways, and places we call home today are merely just continuing the paths and outlines that have been long established millennia ago. These centers of life and trade provided an outline that allowed, at least partially, for the rapid colonization of the land and the growth of early European and American settlements in today's United States. And many of those native cultures responsible for those outlines are still here and not relegated to the history books, on and off reservations, and in many cities around the US. So I encourage you to go find out if where you live or might have visited was formerly a Native American settlement, and to go and find out more about your local tribal communities, well, after the quarantine. And that's it for today. I hope you liked my short documentary, and if you liked the video, please click the like button and subscribe for more videos like this. It really helps a lot. And if you'd like to help support the channel more, or just like to talk to me, follow me on Twitter or check out my Patreon page. Also, use my link to check out the Brave browser and get paid for surfing the internet. Finally, I would like to thank all my subscribers and those of you here for the first time. Thank you for watching. And remember, never stop learning.